Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to be here on the territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people on the unceded territory. And I'm grateful to have the opportunity to talk a bit about this very important issue. And I want to first thank Dr. Ingrid Waldron for her tireless work on this file. When it comes to addressing environmental racism, she has been a strong advocate, and we wouldn't be here with this bill today if it weren't for her work and the work of other amazing advocates. People who've shared their lived experiences, who are doing incredible work to address these issues. I also want to thank my colleague, the member for Saanich Gulf Islands, not only for bringing this private member's bill forward, but for being a champion on environmental racism. And also acknowledge the work of former MP Lenore Zann for presenting this bill in the last Parliament, but also for her work and a presentation of a similar bill in the Nova Scotia legislature. And it's important to reiterate that this work comes from dedicated activists, researchers, and advocates. And I'm incredibly grateful for their dedication, for their knowledge that they continue to share. Mr. Speaker, I also want to touch on an environmental disaster that is currently unraveling. Since May 2022, Imperial Oil has been covering up spillage in an oil sands tailings pond site. 5.3 million liters of water has spilled out of the tailings ponds, leaking into the forest, lake, and rivers nearby. For perspective, that is about twice the volume of an Olympic-sized swimming pool of toxic water. For months, members of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nations have been hunting in these forests, fishing in these waters, breathing the air, and harvesting the food from this area without knowing there were dangerous toxins. Chief Alan Adam has said, and I quote, "Had this happened south of Calgary or right in Calgary, they probably would have notified everybody. It probably would have shut down all the water systems. And they probably would have fixed the problem a lot quicker." Mr. Speaker, I find it appalling that the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation, along with other First Nations and Métis Nations, were kept in the dark while an oil company knowingly polluted their land, their waters. I believe that Chief Adam was correct in his assessment that this wouldn't have happened in a major city. I want every member in this chamber to ask themselves if they could see this happening in Calgary, in Montreal, in Toronto, in Vancouver, or even Victoria. We all know that it wouldn't. So why is it happening in Indigenous communities? Why is it that rich CEOs think they can get away with polluting Indigenous lands and profiting from it? It's because they know that governments will let them. This was clear just a few weeks ago when Liberals and Conservatives teamed up in Environment Committee, voting to delete the words tailings ponds from the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. The situation happening in northern Alberta is shocking, but familiar to many communities. In fact, it's been an ongoing theme in Canada's history. The community of Africville, Nova Scotia, a community of primarily Black residents existing there from early 1900s to the 1960s. Africville was not only denied amenities, but was also forced to deal with hazardous infrastructure. A dump was placed there, along with an infectious disease hospital. And in the 1970s, the Nova Scotian government forced the relocation of the people of Africville. Chemical Valley is another example. The area is home to 40% of Canada's chemical industry. The pollution from this industry impacts everyone in the surrounding area, but especially the people of Amjing-Nun. And Amjing-Nun First Nation is dealing with things like skewed sex ratios, where there are more boys being born than girls. There are significantly higher hospitalization rates. There are higher rates of asthma, heart disease, blood pressure, high blood pressure, along with chronic headaches. How can we expect communities like the Amjing-Nun First Nation to live in dignity when they are forced to deal with the devastating health consequences of environmental racism? I was so disappointed that the government voted down multiple amendments to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act asked for by the Amjingnung First Nation for enforceable air quality standards. 15,000 people die in Canada each year because of air quality issues, and this was a key request. I also want to share the words of Eddie Charlie, an Indigenous residential school survivor and advocate in my riding, who raised the issue of the Crofton Mill using the water from the Cowichan River. And he said, I quote, "For thousands of years, the Cowichan people have relied on fish foods from the Cowichan River and the animals like deer, wolves, cougars, and bears to keep the forest around the rivers healthy. When predators hunt, they take their kills into the forest and provide food for the plants as they grow strong. When wolves and cougars or bears stop going to the river, the forests suffer. The mill in Crofton has for years lowered the river so much that the salmon are no longer returning to their natural spawning grounds," he said. "Please get someone from the House of Commons to address this. Heichka." We need to listen to Eddie and to other Indigenous voices. I've spoken to others who have expressed concerns around logging in the area around the Cowichan River. When it comes to Indigenous people's relationship to their land, air, and water, the reality is that environmental racism continues to impact communities, and often their voices are not heard by policymakers. While this bill is an important first step, we also need an Office of Environmental Justice with funding for impacted communities. We need enforcement of environmental regulations. For decades, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, as well as Black and Brown communities, have been outspoken about how their rights are being violated, how they face higher rates of illness due to pollution, and how their voices have been ignored. This bill is a small step, acknowledging the problems we face, committing to a national action plan, and I hope and I urge my fellow members of Parliament to support this important step. Thank you.